Welcome back everybody. We'll continue our discussion on game theory and borrow concepts from that field and apply them to growing microbial populations to come up with a framework where we represent where fitness is a function of composition of the and population. Fitness is dependent on the frequencies associated with the different genotypes which are present in the environment. So, just to pick up from where we left off last time. So, we are defining a payoff matrix P where P represents of the two strategies that are available A, B, and when these strategies are competed against the two strategies A and B, what is the payoff that a player gets when when strategy A is competed against strategy A? In that case, the payoff associated with what the player who is playing with strategy A gets is small a. When strategy B is competing against strategy A, the payoff for the player playing with strategy B is given by this number C. So, how do we extend this logic to microbial populations? And the way we are going to do that is the following. Imagine two populations which are coexisting in this environment, and again we will call them genotypes A and genotype B. Now, what we are going to do is define a growth rate associated with any individual of genotype A if it was growing in an environment which contained only individuals of genotype A. Also, we will define another growth rate associated with A individual of genotype A, assuming that this individual is growing in a population where everybody else in the environment belongs to genotype B. Okay. So, let's define these quantities. Let A be the growth rate of an individual of genotype A if everyone else in the population was genotype A. Okay. So, this corresponds to talking of a case where there is only one particular genotype which is present in the environment, which is genotype A, and in that case what is the growth rate associated with A individual in this environment. Compare this to the second quantity we want to define as B, which is growth rate of an individual of genotype A if all others are genotype B. And this corresponds to a situation that we are talking of growth rate associated with one particular individual belonging to genotype A, which is growing in an environment where everybody else is of genotype B. So, this can be thought of as an environment where where everyone was genotype B, and this one particular mutant has arisen which is of genotype A. And how does this mutant grow in terms of in the presence of everybody else which is of a different genotype is represented by number B. Similarly, we define C and D. C represents to individual of genotype B when all others are of genotype A, and D refers to growth rate of individual of genotype B given that all others are of genotype B. So, we define these four quantities, and what this should tell you is that this looks very similar to the payoff matrix that we defined. And in fact, we are going to use these definitions of small a, b, c, d to define our own payoff matrix in terms of microbial growth rates associated in very specific environments. So, now payoff matrix for my environment is just A and B, and now A and B are now not strategies, but genotypes. And I know when genotype A is growing in the presence of genotype A, the growth rate is A. When genotype A is growing in presence of in an environment where everybody else is genotype B, its growth rate is B, and C and D complete the matrix. So, these are the growth rates associated with these two particular genotypes when they are growing in an environment which have these two particular genotypes. So, that is my equivalent payoff matrix. Now, the next thing that we want to define is what would be the fitness of an individual if the composition of the population at any given point was defined by XA and XB. So, if the population at any given point is defined by the vector x, then what is fitness of A and fitness of B? This is what we are interested in at this point, and we want to make use of our payoff matrix to help answer this question. But remember, the payoff matrix only talks about fitnesses when one particular genotype is growing in the presence of everybody else, which could be genotype A or B. So, it does not talk of cases where there are finite compositions of XA, XB associated with the population. It talks only about the case where one particular individual is growing in an environment where everybody else either belongs to its own genotype or everybody else is of a different genotype. That is the context in which the payoff matrix is defined. But if the population is defined by this particular vector, then how would you come up with an expression for FA and FB? And the answer to that can be thought in terms of probability. So, let's imagine our environment to be, let me just draw this. Let us imagine our environment like this, and this environment now has individuals of genotype A and also individuals of genotype B. So, let this be B and let this be A. These two coexist, and now what we are interested in is at this particular instant, at this composition of the population, what is f of A? And we know that if an A individual was growing in all A individuals, then its fitness was small a, and if an A individual was growing in all B, then its fitness was defined by small b. But we do not know what would be the fitness FAB if it was growing in a population whose composition was defined by something like this, where the fraction of individuals of genotype A and are XA, fraction of individuals of genotype B are XB. Of course, we are not going to get a very exact answer in terms of what exactly is the growth rate associated in a case like this, but what we are going to assume is that if XA is the fraction of population which belong to genotype A in this setting, then the chances that this, so if we are talking in the context of this particular individual and finding out its growth rate in this composition, then the chances that this particular individual encounters another A type are XA. So, before we develop this expression, chances that an genotype A individual encounters another A individual are equal to XA. The probability that this individual interacts with another individual of genotype A are XA, and the chance that an A individual encounters a B individual are given by XB. Now, if an A individual was always encountering an A individual, then the growth rate we have already found to be equal to A. On the other hand, if an A individual was always encountering a B individual, then the growth rate would have been B. Hence, we write FA as just weighted sums of these two probabilities. FA is just given by XA times A plus XB times B. And what this represents is that if A was always growing with A type individuals, then its growth rate would be 1. So, if you plug in XA equal to 1 here, that automatically means XB is equal to 0 and FA just comes out to be equal to A. If you plug XB equal to 1, which means XA equal to 0, f of A automatically comes out to be equal to B. And hence this is a linear interpolation between these two extremes, and what you are saying is that at any composition XA and XB of the population, the fitness of the individual can be given as weighted mean of the two growth rates if they were growing with all A's and all B's, and weights here, the weights you assign to each of these growth rates are equal to the frequency of the particular genotype that we are interested in here. So, that sort of allows us to define FA, and for the first time what we are able to do is define fitness, where fitness is actually a function of the composition of the population now. Okay. This of course is XA. Let me just rewrite that. FA is just equal to XA times A plus XB times B. So, this is sort of the first representation that we have, where fitnesses are a function of the composition of the population. All right. So, if this is equal to FA, what would FB be equal to? You should perhaps pause the video for 30 seconds and try to do this yourself. This is just an extension of what we have been talking about so far. So, again, if a B individual was always growing with an A individual, then if a B individual was growing in an environment where everybody else was an A individual, was A genotype, then its growth rate was C. But if a B individual was growing in an environment where everybody else was a B genotype, then the growth rate associated with that particular individual was D. Hence, we just weight these two numbers by the two genotypes associated, and we get fitness of B as the following function. And on the previous page, we had just derived that FA is equal to XA times A plus XB times B. So, in terms of our payoff matrix, these are the fitnesses of the two genotypes at any given composition of the population, where the composition is defined by number of individuals which belong to a particular genotype. So, what does this tell us in terms of where the population is going to move if I were to start it from any random mixture of A and B individuals? What does this tell me about the dynamics of the system? And in the last lecture, we have already seen that for a case where fitness is dependent on frequency of individuals of a particular genotype, the dynamics of the system are defined by the following relationships, which is dxa by dt is equal to xa times 1 minus xa times Fa dependent on composition minus Fb dependent on composition. You can write the similar equation for dxp by dt, and all we have to do to understand dynamics of this particular system now is plug in these expressions for Fa and Fb into this term here, and that would give me Xa times 1 minus Xa times Xa times A plus Xb times B minus Xc times A minus, I am sorry, I wrote this wrong, this is Xa times C minus Xb times D. That is the expression that we have for the dynamics of dxa by dt. And we can simplify this further by substituting for xb equal to 1 minus xa, because we know that at any given point in time xa plus xb is just equal to 1. And if we do that, we get dxa by dt equals xa times 1 minus xa times xa into a plus 1 minus xa into b minus xa into c minus 1 minus xa into d. Okay. So, we have this longish expression which defines the dynamics associated with the system, but we can simplify this a little bit more, and we can do that by bringing together all the terms that contain xa. We can bring together all the terms that contain xa here. So, if I write xa, this is the first term which contains xa, so this is a. This is the second term, but it has a minus sign here, so minus b. This is the third term, also has a minus sign, minus c. This is the fourth term, it has two minuses here, so this becomes positive. And we write whatever is left now. So, one of the things that left is this 1 times b plus b, and the second thing that is left is this minus 1 into d, which is b minus d. So, that is the expression that we have for dxa by dt. We can derive a similar expression for dxb by dt. That is just going to be a mirror image of this. So, that is not going to tell us anything new about the system. Alright. So, that is the relationship that we have which defines the dynamics associated with this system. And now what we are going to try and do is try and imagine scenarios depending on the values that small a, b, c, d are able to take. We can create, let us try and see if we can create the 4 scenarios that we discussed when we started our discussion on evolutionary game theory. So, the 4 scenarios that we were talking about were all A, all B, coexistence and bistability. And what we want to see here is that are we able to create those scenarios here by choosing particular values of A, B, C, D, small a, b, c, d, our payoff matrix, such that the system dynamics automatically takes us towards those 4 cases. Before we do that, we should just take a look and identify the 4 steady states associated with the system. I am sorry, the 3 steady states associated with the system, and those are, this would give me just x a equal to 0. So, again I am looking at all values of x a such that dxa by dt is equal to 0, and this is the first one. The second one is if I equate this term equal to 0, which gives me x a equal to 1. And both these are sort of intuitive in a way, because this represents the case where there is no a but all b, and this represents a case where there is all a and no b. So, these 2 cases essentially are talking about a single species just existing by itself and there being no other genotype. But the third case is obtained when I equate this expression equal to 0, and that gives me my third steady state associated with the system, which is d minus b divided by A minus B minus C plus D. Okay. So, these are the three steady states which are associated with the system as we have just defined. Now, one of the things that you should note here is this third steady state is not guaranteed to exist all the time, because depending on the values of A, B and C and D that you end up choosing, or you may have for a particular system, those particular values when you plug those in here could give you x A for instance, which is less than 0. So, whether this exists as a stable whether this value of x A exists as a steady state or not depends on particular values in your payoff matrix P, because a choice of A, B, C, D could very well exist such that x A comes out to be negative, and in that sense that is not a representative of physiology of the case that we are discussing, and that is a irrelevant steady state for us, and we just throw that out. That one does not help us in any way, and that is a stable state that does not exist in the system as we have described it. So, in those cases we are only left with two steady states, x A equal to 0 and x A equal to 1. Okay. So, every time we pick A, B, C, D, we need to check whether x A defined this particular way lies between 0 and 1, or does it lie outside this window. If it lies outside of this window, this steady state does not exist as far as our particular system is concerned. Alright, so we have these three steady states. One of them we need to check for its existence with every particular set of A, B, C, D that we take. So, how do we look at this? Let's imagine a case where, so let's say this is case 1. Let's imagine a case where A is greater than C and B is greater than D. Okay. And now let's try and understand that what a case like this would try and tell us. First, let's look at, we can do this a few different ways, and we are going to do that. But first, let's look at this via our equation. Remember, our equation said dxa by dt equals xa times 1 minus xa times xa into a minus b minus c plus d plus b minus d. And we are saying that for a particular scenario, these are the conditions on A, B, C, D that we are working this system, that we are looking at this system at. Now, let us take a look at what does this mean. What this means is that x A of course is always greater than 0. It could be equal to 0, but that is a steady state x A equal to 0. So, we are ignoring x A equal to 1 and x A equal to 0 and talking for any other composition of the population other than x A equal to 0 and x A equal to 1. So, if we are not talking of x A equal to 0 and x A equal to 1, this is always greater than 0, this is also always greater than 0. What about this third term where A, B, C, D come into play? And what I can write this as, I could rearrange this and write this third expression as x A times A minus C. I am just pulling A and C from here, and then write this as plus B minus D minus x A into B minus D, right. So, this B minus D comes from here, and this minus x A B minus D are the two terms that I left out from this particular expression. And if I simplify this further, I get x A into A minus C plus 1 minus x A into B minus D. And if I do this, then what I get is that x A into A minus C, but I have been given that A is greater than C. So, this is always greater than 0, plus 1 minus xa, which is always greater than 0, times b minus d, which under the given conditions is also always greater than 0. So, this is also greater than 0. What I end up getting under these conditions is that dxa by dt is always positive under these conditions, which means this particular condition on my payoff matrix implies that I am talking of a case which is all A. Okay. Because dxa by dt as shown here is always increasing, the population will keep on increasing and eventually B will be competed out from the environment. Another way to look at this is in terms of my payoff matrix, which is P equals A, B, C, D. And what we are saying here is that A is greater than C and B is greater than D. And remember, these correspond to the small a, b, c, d correspond to growth rates defined in this particular fashion. If A is bigger than C, what we are saying in that case is that in presence of what we are saying there is that in presence of A type individuals, an A individual grows better than a B individual. This can be seen from here because A is greater than C and A represents a scenario when a particular A individual is growing in an environment where everybody is genotype A, whereas C refers to the scenario where a B type individual, a single B type individual is growing in an environment where everybody else is of genotype A. Since A is greater than C, we are saying that in presence of an environment where everybody else is A genotype, an A individual does better than B individuals. And similarly, B greater than D implies that in presence of all B, an A individual grows better than a B individual. And that's telling us the same thing, that so what both of these put together are telling us is that independent of what is the composition of the environment, if I am an individual in a particular environment, independent of whether I am surrounded by individuals of genotype A or individuals of genotype B, an A individual is always going to do better than an individual of genotype B. And if an individual of genotype A is always going to do better irrespective of the environment, that means selection is just going to act straight up and just eliminate individuals which belong to genotype B from the environment. And we again go back to the scenario that this scenario, these conditions on A, B, C, D are going to lead me to a scenario where I get all A and no B in the environment. Okay. We will continue this discussion in the next lecture onwards. Thank you.